Get away from me. I don't want to sit next to that." Her voice pierced the stillness of first class, laced with a disgust so sharp it made nearby heads turn. The woman, mid-40s, draped in a high-end blanket, sunglasses still on inside the cabin, clutched the seat's armrest like a throne. With a single sweep of her hand, she knocked the boarding pass out of the black man's grasp. It fluttered to the floor between them. No one moved. For a second, time hung still. Then the soft clatter of the paper echoed like a slap across every face watching. He bent down, silently picked it up, and looked at her. Calm, unbothered, dead quiet, but the fire in the room had already been lit. She crossed her arms, her tone now dripping with mock sympathy. "Look, I pay for the space. Maybe you're confused. People like you don't usually sit up here." Her smirk stretched slowly, confident that the silence of those watching was her shield. But what she didn't notice, what she never thought to question, was the slight nod from the black man as he calmly held up his boarding pass. 1E, the exact seat she sprawled across. Her eyes scanned the ticket, then flicked back to him. Still, she didn't move. Instead, she leaned back and said louder this time, "I already told the attendant. I need both seats for medical reasons. It can sit in the back. I have friends in corporate, honey." Around them, the cabin hushed into a thicker silence. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were recording. Phones angled discreetly behind headrests. Fingers hovered over screens. The tension wasn't loud, but it pressed on every chest like a held breath. The flight attendant, visibly torn, approached with a polite but brittle smile, her eyes darting between the boarding pass and the woman's blanket-covered legs. Before she could speak, the woman raised a hand. "Sweetheart, please. I'm not trying to cause a scene. Just help him find a seat in economy where he'll be more comfortable. This is all a misunderstanding." And with that, she looked away, as if the matter had been settled, as if the man beside her had vanished into irrelevance. But he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, expression calm, eyes steady, not with defeat, but with something deeper. Authority, perhaps, or restraint sharpened by experience. And as the woman turned away, waving him off like background noise, one passenger leaned over to whisper, "Wait. Isn't that Dominic Hayes?" The name carried like static through the cabin. Fingers froze mid-text. A murmur swelled. The woman didn't hear it. Not yet. She had no idea the man she just humiliated was the co-founder of the very airline she was sitting on. The early lights spilled gently across the glass walls of Seattle's Lumen Field Terminal, casting a golden glow that masked the tension building within Gate 36. Business travelers clutched coffee cups and tapped impatient fingers on rolling suitcases. But one man, tall, calm, dressed in an understated wool coat and jeans, moved through the crowd with the stillness of someone immune to rush. His name was Dominic Hayes. To most people at Alara Air, the name meant luxury in the skies, a pioneering airline reshaping passenger dignity. But today, Dominic didn't come as a face of the company. He came as a passenger. No entourage, no announcements. Just a quiet man with a first-class boarding pass and a right to sit exactly where he'd booked. Seat 1E. When Dominic stepped in a first-class cabin, he scanned the aisle with practiced ease until he stopped at 1E, his seat. Except it wasn't empty. Karen Whitmore, draped in designer layers and reclining like royalty, had already claimed the space. Her legs crossed defiantly across the adjacent seat. Her designer carry-on bag sat perched in 1F, as if she owned a row. Dominic paused, calmly held up his boarding pass. "Ma'am," he said in a tone void of aggression, "this is seat 1E. You might be in the wrong place." Karen didn't even glance at the paper. She gave a half laugh, the kind meant to dismiss without explanation. "No, you're mistaken. I pay for this space. I always sit here." The air between them thickened. Dominic didn't move, but neither did she. Around them, whispers grew legs. One man angled his phone discreetly toward the confrontation, while a woman across the aisle glanced down at the boarding pass in Dominic's hand, and then back at Karen, brows raised. The first to approach was Chloe Grant, a flight attendant with a calm face but restless eyes. She leaned in with professional grace and asked gently, "Ma'am, can I check your seat assignment, please?" Karen didn't look up. "I already told you, I need both seats. It's a medical thing. I get lightheaded." She waved her hand dismissively, nails painted a pristine ivory. "Besides, I know people in corporate. Just let him sit back there. I'm sure he'll understand." Chloe hesitated, eyes flicking to Dominic, then back to the manifest in her hand. The name Dominic Hayes sat clearly next to 1E. Her throat tightened. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in the company did. But Dominic gave her a nearly imperceptible nod, signaling, "Stay neutral. Don't make this about titles." Karen, still oblivious, adjusted her blanket dramatically and tilted her seat further back. "You people always want to make things difficult." Her words weren't shouted, but they landed hard. Around them, the weight of every word grew heavier. The silence wasn't passive, it was charged. Marcus, the purser, stepped in with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen every kind of in-flight conflict, just never one this quietly volatile. "Good morning, ma'am," he said smoothly. "We're reviewing the manifest now. While we do, would you mind allowing Mr. Hayes to sit in his assigned seat?" Karen turned to him, her voice rising just enough. "I don't feel safe," she said, her tone trembling with false fragility. "Look at how he's staring at me. This is harassment. If anything happens on this flight, it's on all of you." The accusation rippled through the air like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. A visible wave of discomfort moved across the passengers. People exchanged uneasy glances, some guilty, some outraged, others simply unwilling to get involved. Dominic didn't react. He didn't flinch. He simply stepped back, arms at his sides, the picture of control. Yet that control spoke louder than outrage ever could. The sunlight outside grew brighter, spilling across the cabin windows, catching the tension like it caught the dust in the air, clear, undeniable, and blinding in its honesty. From the galley, Chloe and Marcus huddled beside the coffee station, voices hushed beneath the hum of the cabin. "She's refusing to move," Marcus muttered, "but he's the CEO. If we push her too hard, this thing could blow up online." Chloe's jaw tightened. It already has. Someone's live streaming. We're trending. A third flight attendant leaned in, eyes wide. "Passengers are talking. If we back her up, we lose them all." Chloe looked toward seat 1, where Dominic now stood like a silent cornerstone, holding the whole situation together without lifting a finger. "If we fold now," she whispered, "we tell every person watching that dignity is negotiable." Back in the cabin, Karen reclined deeper, pretending to be unfazed, but her words grew sharper. "You all act so progressive," she muttered under her breath, "but you're just another mob in uniforms." Her voice floated just loud enough for others to hear. Across the aisle, a businessman who had kept his eyes on his laptop snapped it shut. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "you're the only one making this difficult." Karen shot him a venomous glare. "Mind your business." But the tide was shifting. The captain's voice broke in over the intercom, announcing a minor delay due to systems checks. Everyone knew that wasn't true. The aircraft hadn't even pushed back. The delay wasn't mechanical, it was moral, and in the growing silence, the real turbulence was only just beginning. The cabin doors remained sealed, a glaring reminder that no one was going anywhere. Karen shifted in her seat, clearly sensing the shift in atmosphere. She clutched her blanket tighter, as if it could shield her from the judgment thickening in the air. Around her, the silence had turned into something else entirely. Anticipation. First class had never felt more like a courtroom. Chloe returned, this time walking slower, her expression carefully controlled. She stopped beside Karen, voice firmer than before. "Ma'am, we've rechecked the manifest. You are assigned to 2B. Mr. Hayes is assigned to 1E. We need you to move to your correct seat." Karen's jaw tightened. "I want to speak to someone above you." I said, "I know people in corporate." Her voice cracked ever so slightly. "Call your supervisor." She was stalling. Hoping someone, anyone, would back her up. Karen's voice rose another octave, no longer wrapped in entitlement but desperation. "This is discrimination." she barked, her eyes darting from one uniformed crew member to the next. "I'll call my lawyer. You can't treat me like this. I don't feel safe next to him. I'm being targeted." Her hands trembled, whether from anger or fear. No one could tell. She glanced around, searching for allies, but no one jumped in. Across the aisle, the same businessman who had spoken earlier now leaned back, arms crossed, eyes steady. Chloe said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was backed by protocol now, and by something stronger, conviction. Dominic finally spoke, quiet, unshaken. "Everyone here has a job to do, including you. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." His voice wasn't loud, but it settled across the space like a final verdict. Karen recoiled slightly, then spat. "You don't scare me. You're just another man in a suit." But her words didn't sting. They revealed something else. She had finally realized he wasn't just another passenger. She just didn't know yet how far her mistake had gone. The air had shifted. Even without a word, it was clear the tide was turning. Karen turned to the cabin, her voice higher now, teetering on panic. "You're all witnesses," she said, eyes wide. "I'm being targeted for simply asking for a little comfort. This man is intimidating me, and now the crew's enabling it." For a moment, no one responded. Then, from row 3, a woman with streaks of silver in her hair and quiet authority in her voice spoke up. "We all watched you refuse to move your blanket. Ma'am, it's not about comfort. It's about what's fair." A few heads nodded. Karen stiffened. "You don't know what I'm dealing with. You don't know what I've been through." Another passenger, a black woman in sharp navy business wear, raised her voice just enough to carry. "Actually, we do. People like us get told to move all the time. But now you're the one refusing." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came. She looked smaller now, shrinking beneath the weight of a cabin, no longer willing to look away. Chloe, still composed, leaned slightly forward. "Ma'am, the world is already hearing about this." The implication was chilling. There was no saving face now. At the gate, footsteps echoed across the boarding bridge. A new presence entered the cabin, tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that said more than any name badge could. Brian Okoro, Vice President of Corporate Risk for Alara's parent company, gave a subtle nod to Dominic as he passed. He didn't glance at Karen, didn't need to. His arrival was the signal everyone had been waiting for. Without a word, he joined Chloe and Marcus near the galley, exchanging quiet updates. "It's above our pay grade now," Marcus murmured. Brian's voice was steady. "Boards are watching. Social's on fire. We don't cave to privilege or panic. Our dignity policy stance." Back in her seat, Karen scrolled frantically on her phone, trying to call someone, anyone, but the Wi-Fi dropped. No bars, no connection, no disk queue. Her finger jabbed the screen over and over, but the cabin remained silent, unmoved. Dominic sat back down, hands clasped in his lap, eyes straight ahead. He didn't need to say anything. His presence said everything. And for the first time since she boarded, Karen looked unsure. Her mask of confidence was cracking, line by line. Karen finally stood, her shoulders squared like a defendant, making her final plea. "I want off this plane," she declared, voice shaking beneath its volume. "You can't keep me here against my will." She stormed toward the galley, but Brian stepped calmly into her path. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you are not being detained, but for security reasons. No one is allowed to deplane until the situation is resolved." Karen blinked. Her power, once assumed, once unshakable, had no traction here. "You'll hear from my lawyers," she snapped. "I'll ruin every one of you." Dominic's voice, low and composed, drifted from his seat. "You're welcome to try, but every word, every moment, is being recorded." Karen froze. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. The room didn't gasp. It didn't need to. The real spectacle wasn't in her fury. It was in how utterly alone she had become. For once, power didn't bend to arrogance. It held its line, firm and quiet. And now, the entire flight sat still, waiting, not for an apology, but for a resolution. And that decision no longer belonged to her. The minutes stretched like hours. The aircraft still hadn't pushed back. First-class passengers shifted in their seats, But no one stood. No one complained. Not about the delay. Not about the growing heat of scrutiny that now pointed squarely in Karen's direction. From behind her, a woman in a burgundy pantsuit typed quickly on a tablet. "I'm documenting this," she whispered to her seatmate, not even looking up. "The world deserves to see what happens when people push too far." A man nearby was already live tweeting the event with quiet precision. Hashtags multiplying. Hashtag who is Dominic Hayes. Hashtag flight dignity. Hashtag privilege in first class. Karen, still standing near the galley, clenched her jaw as if holding back a scream. The confidence that once propped up every dismissive comment had dissolved. Now, her voice broke through the silence, not with fire, but with desperation. "What you try to prove," she said, not to anyone in particular, "that you're better than everyone else, that you can buy your way through anything." No one answered, but it was clear she wasn't talking to the cabin anymore. She was talking to the one man who hadn't moved. Dominic didn't turn to face her right away. He sat still, hands folded, watching the light shift across the window. When he finally did look at her, his eyes were steady. Not angry, not cold, just done. "I'm not proving anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow it reached every corner of the cabin. "I'm just asking for what's right." The effect was immediate. A few passengers shifted upright. Someone exhaled sharply through their nose. Even Chloe paused mid-step. The simplicity of his words cut sharper than any insult. Karen's mouth twitched. Her face flushed deep red. The kind that comes not just from embarrassment, but from the realization that something irreversible had already happened. She looked away quickly, blinking too often. "This isn't over," she muttered to herself, voice barely audible. "You'll regret this." But no one was listening anymore. Not really. The story had already shifted, and for once, it wasn't hers to control. The intercom crackled, and for a moment, everyone straightened in anticipation. The captain's voice came through, measured, calm, unmistakably official. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. This flight will remain grounded until further notice, pending direction from corporate leadership." Gasps were stifled, glances exchanged. No one had ever heard that phrase before. Not weather-related, not technical, not even security. Just direction from leadership. And in that coded language, everyone understood. Dominic wasn't just a passenger anymore. Karen stood frozen in the aisle, her confidence bleeding out in silence. She tapped at her phone again. Still no signal. Even the Wi-Fi seemed to betray her. She looked around the cabin and found no eyes meeting hers. No allies. The same passengers who had once shifted uncomfortably in silence now faced forward with a quiet sense of resolve. A man 2 rows back began outlining a legal analysis on his iPad, fingers dancing across the glass. Beside him, a college student posted, watching a masterclass in calm power. Hashtag dignity flies first. And as the screen lights flicker across the cabin, the very idea of who held power on this flight had changed entirely. Karen's composure shattered in slow motion. She turned to Chloe, voice thin and frantic. "Do something. You can't let him sit there and make me feel unsafe. This is wrong. He's intimidating me, manipulating you all." But the words didn't land the way they once might have. Chloe straightened her posture, her voice no longer apologetic. "Ma'am, every passenger is being treated as booked. That includes you." Karen's mouth dropped open. "So you're just gonna let him win?" she hissed. Before anyone could respond, a man in a navy blazer spoke up from across the aisle. "You try to take a seat. We all saw it." A woman further back added, "You made everyone late." Not him. Their tone wasn't angry, it was exhausted, as if they had watched this scene play out in 100 different ways before, and they were done pretending not to notice. Karen's gaze darted around, looking for someone, anyone, to restore her narrative, but no one met her eyes. Even the crew passed her by now with polite indifference, serving drinks to others, asking if passengers were comfortable, but not acknowledging her presence. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, was fading into the soft hum of a flight that had outgrown her control. As a new crew boarded, handpicked by corporate, crisp in demeanor and quiet in their resolve. Chloe exhaled for the first time in what felt like an hour. She walked down the aisle, not toward chaos, but toward restoration. Dominic remained seated, gaze steady, untouched by the noise. No smugness, no blotting, just a man who refused to move. Not out of stubbornness, but because something bigger demanded stillness. Chloe stopped by his seat, lowering her voice to just above a whisper. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Not just for standing your ground, but for showing us how." He nodded once. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what we let slide, and what we choose to fix." A few rows back, a little boy, no older than 7, tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed at Dominic. "Mom, is he the boss of the plane?" The mother smiled softly, eyes glassy. "Not exactly, sweetie," she whispered, "but he's the reason we're still flying right." And with that, the moment landed. Not with thunder, but with quiet clarity. The cabin had chosen, and the plane, finally, began to breathe again. By the time the aircraft finally pushed back from a gate, something had shifted in the cabin that couldn't be undone. Karen, now seated alone in her proper row, stared blankly at the sea back in front of her, lips pressed into a line, eyes blinking fast. No one spoke to her. No one met her gaze. The woman who once commanded attention now sat invisible. Dominic, meanwhile, had taken a seat in one, quietly, gracefully, as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew everything had. The captain didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Somewhere behind the curtain of operational jargon and delayed departures, a quiet chain of authority had been redrawn. And now, that authority rested firmly with a man who hadn't raised his voice once. The man whose restraint spoke louder than power ever could. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the real storm was happening far below. In devices, news feeds, inboxes. The hashtags had gone viral. Hashtag dignity flies first. Hashtag our accountability. Hashtag quiet power. Each one carried snippets of video, typed captions with disbelief and awe. This man just sat there and shifted the entire flight's culture. He never raised his voice. Not once. And yet, everyone listened. Karen's name began trending too, but not for the reasons she once expected. Her story, spun so carefully at the start, was unraveling faster than she could catch it. In a cruel twist of irony, she had become a case study. Not an influence, but in the collapse of unearned confidence. She tried to flag down a flight attendant mid-service, asking for water, then a blanket, then an answer. Each time, she received a polite nod, and nothing more. Her needs weren't ignored. They were simply no longer prioritized. The cabin had recalibrated. Her demands had faded into the background hum of a flight realigned. Later in the flight, as the cabin lights dimmed and the clinking of ice and glasses softened, Chloe quietly approached seat 1E. Her posture was relaxed now, but there was something in her expression, a mix of respect, relief, and something deeper. "Mr. Hayes," she began, keeping her voice low so as not to disturb the aisle. "I just wanted to thank you, not just for standing up for yourself, but for giving the rest of us permission to do the same." Dominic looked up from his tablet, where messages from his internal team kept coming in. Screenshots of trending posts, coverage requests, even an early draft of the company's official statement. He offered a soft smile, but his tone remained measured. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what we've all let slide for too long. If no one ever says enough, it never changes." Chloe nodded slowly, blinking back something behind her eyes. Well, today something did, and then she turned and continued down the aisle, not as a woman shaken by conflict, but as someone who had just seen the standard rise. When the plane touched down at JFK, the seatbelt signs clicked off, but no one rushed to stand. It was as if everyone on board understood that something weightier than turbulence had occurred. Through the cabin windows, the terminal bustled with movement, but on the jet bridge stood a different kind of welcome committee, a row of suited media reps with press badges, a few security personnel, one cameraman already rolling. Dominic stepped off the plane first, moving through the crowd like any other traveler. No security escort, no statement prepared, just presence, just poise. Reporters shouted questions, but he didn't flinch. He didn't need the last word. Behind him, Karen followed, shoulders hunched, sunglasses now hiding her face instead of completing her look. A single flashbulb popped, then another, but no one called her name. No microphones swung her way. The silence that once protected her entitlement now swallowed her whole. And as she was gently escorted aside, not detained, not arrested, just redirected, every camera lens followed her not out of interest but consequence. For the first time in her curated life, she wasn't in control of a narrative. The world was watching, and it had already decided who it was listening to. In the days that followed, Alara Air released a public statement, not just an apology, but a commitment to every passenger who's ever felt invisible, unheard, or unvalued. It read, "We saw you too late." That changes now. New initiatives were rolled out. Mandatory dignity training, anonymous reporting channels, and a transparency-first policy for all customer incidents. Dominic didn't appear in the press tour. He declined interviews. He didn't need a headline. He'd already left a watermark. And yet, his influence rippled far beyond the runway. On a different day, weeks later, on a different flight, a young woman boarded and found a man sitting in her assigned first-class seat. He smiled casually, gestured to the empty spot beside him. "It's just a seat," he shrugged. But before she could respond, a crew member stepped in, voice unwavering. "Sir, our passenger dignity policy requires all customers to be seated as assigned. We appreciate your cooperation." The woman blinked, nodded, sat down, uninterrupted, unquestioned, and as she buckled in, she glanced out the window. A jet roared into the sky, its shadow crossing the tarmac like a silent vow. Sometimes, the seat you defend today doesn't just make space for yourself. It lifts everyone else tomorrow. New York was a blur of lights and movement that evening, but Dominic Hayes moved through it as if untouched by the noise. He stepped off the escalator, coat draped over one arm, carry-on in tow. No entourage, no media escort, just a man leaving an airport. But for everyone who watched him walk through that terminal, there was a shift in how they looked at him. And, perhaps more importantly, at each other. No one announced who he was. No voice over the intercom named his title. Yet the quiet nods, the subtle glances, the slight straightening of postures as he passed, they told a different story. One that didn't need press releases or hashtags to be felt. For Dominic, there was no victory lap, no need for applause, just clarity, the kind that settles into your bones after you've done the thing you knew mattered, even when you never planned to do it all. In offices high above the runways, Alara's internal culture began to change. Not through slogans, but through behavior. Crew members who had once defaulted to silence now asked questions, pressed back, protected dignity like it was policy because now it was. Marcus began hosting roundtable meetings with junior staff, asking what dignity meant to them. Chloe was quietly promoted to a training oversight role, where she designed modules not just on safety, but on respect under pressure. But it wasn't just the airline that changed. It was the people. A lawyer who'd been seated in row 2 rewrote his firm's internal guidelines on conflict de-escalation after watching how Dominic never once raised his voice. A teenage boy who'd record a part of the encounter later posted a school essay titled, "What Power Looks Like When It's Quiet." Even a retired woman in economy class who hadn't said a word during the flight wrote a letter to corporate saying, "Thank you. I finally saw someone like my grandson win with grace." As Dominic stepped through the sliding doors of the terminal into the cool evening air, there was no one waiting to greet him. No welcome banner, no board of directors, just streetlights casting long shadows and the sound of suitcases rolling behind strangers. But something intangible followed him. The passengers who had once hesitated to speak now walked with their heads held a little higher. The crew who had once second-guessed themselves now stood taller, firmer, clearer. Even the airport staff, those in reflective vests near the tarmac, exchanged glances that said, without speaking, "We saw what happened, and it mattered." Dominic didn't look back. He didn't need to. The seat he defended had already become more than a seat. It was a line in the sand, a new altitude of expectation, and somewhere Far above in the quiet sky, a jet passed overhead, silent, sure, dignified. The kind of flight that doesn't announce itself with noise, but leaves a trail that others will follow.